April 18, 1943, somewhere in the Pacific. When American engineers first examined Japan's captured Betty bomber, they were stunned. Its massive fuel tanks had no protection at all. No armor, no self-sealing system, nothing. To them, it looked like a flying coffin. But what they discovered next explained why Japan had built one of the most dangerous and self-destructive aircraft of the entire war. At first, they thought the wreck was a mistake. The Mitsubishi G4M sat scorched and twisted on a coral airstrip. Its olive paint blistered, the red suns on its wings faded under Pacific sun. A machine meant for war, yet built with the fragility of a glider. Lieutenant Robert Ames, an aeronautical engineer from the U.S. Army Air Forces, stood before it with a notebook and disbelief. "Jesus," muttered Sergeant Carl Donovan, his assistant, crouching by the wing. "This thing's paper thin." Ames ran his hand along the fuselage. It felt wrong. The skin flexed under pressure. "It's lighter than anything we've built," he said. "You could puncture this with a screwdriver." They pried open an inspection panel. Inside gleamed a fuel tank the size of a bathtub, made entirely of bare aluminum. No self-sealing rubber, no protective lining, nothing but a few millimeters of metal separating volatile aviation fuel from the outside world. Donovan blinked. "Where's the armor?" "There isn't any," Ames replied, voice low. "Not even around the crew seats." He could almost hear it, the echo of bullets slicing through the wings, the hiss of ignited vapor, the screams as flames raced through the cabin. He'd read reports of these planes exploding mid-air after a single hit, but seeing the design up close turned rumor into horror. "Write this down," Ames said, pacing. "Fuel system, no self-sealing layer. Fire suppression, none. Structure, ultra-lightweight, magnesium alloy spars, minimal protection. Prioritizes range above survivability." Donovan scribbled into his logbook, shaking his head. "So, this wasn't bad engineering." Ames looked up. "No, it's deliberate." Outside, the sea breeze carried the smell of salt and oil. Palm fronds rattled in the wind. The wrecked Betty shimmered under the heat, beautiful in its design, terrible in its logic. Months later, in the Philippines, that same logic returned to haunt them. Clark Air Base was newly captured, a graveyard of twisted planes, smouldering fuel drums, and burned hangars. The Japanese had retreated north, leaving behind the bones of their air fleet. Among the wrecks stood another Betty, nearly intact this time, its fuselage scorched but whole. The Americans gathered around it like archaeologists uncovering a mystery they already half understood. The rising sun emblem was half melted, the cockpit glass shattered, but the airframe still glowed faintly green under the tropical sun. Ames climbed onto the wing. "Let's take her apart piece by piece. I want every inch documented." Over 2 days they worked, unscrewing panels, tracing fuel lines, photographing every joint and wire. The deeper they went, the more it defied American logic. "Sir," Donovan called out, "look at this." Inside the fuselage, directly behind the co-pilot's seat, ran a bundle of fuel lines, exposed and unarmored. They snaked across the floor like veins, connecting the main tanks to the engines. Ames crouched beside them, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "One hit here," he whispered, "and the entire plane becomes a fireball." He stood in silence for a moment, staring through the cracked canopy at the distant jungle. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of artillery echoed, a reminder that the war was still raging, that these wrecks weren't history yet. That night, under dim lamplight, Ames sat outside the hangar with a cup of black coffee and his notebook open on his knee. The tropical insects sang around him. He could still see the shape of the Betty in his mind, the delicate curve of its wings, the impossible range it achieved by shedding everything that made survival possible. "What kind of mind builds something like that?" he asked quietly. Donovan, sitting beside him, shrugged. "The kind that plans to win before dying matters." Ames nodded slowly. Yeah, the kind that fights an ocean away from home and knows there's no rescue coming. He stared into the dark. They built a bomber that could reach us before we could reach them. That was the whole game. The next morning, under pale sunlight, the team gathered to perform engine tests. The Betty's twin Mitsubishi Kasei engines coughed and sputtered before roaring to life, a sharp metallic sound unlike any American radial. The propellers spun, whipping dust into the air. The bomber trembled. Even at idle, the wings seemed to flex unnaturally. Ames watched carefully, arms folded. "She's lighter than a B-25 by almost 6,000 pounds, he said. Every gram they saved went into fuel. A mechanic leaned close and shouted over the noise. "That's what gives it the range, right?" Ames nodded. "Almost 4,000 miles, one of the longest in the world." 4,000? Donovan repeated. "Christ, that's halfway across the Pacific." "Exactly," Ames said. "They built range out of flesh and fire." As the engines whined louder, Ames turned to his men. "That's why our pilots hated these things. Not because they were strong, because they were relentless." The engines sputtered to silence, and the air filled again with the sound of wind through the palms. The team stood around the bomber, watching the heat shimmer from its cowling. Ames closed his notebook and said quietly, "Now we know why they burned so easily, and why they kept coming anyway." He turned toward the hangar. "Let's start the full breakdown tomorrow. I want to know how far desperation can fly." The others followed in silence as the afternoon light faded. Behind them, the captured Betty rested on the cracked runway, its wings long, elegant, and utterly doomed. The kind of machine that could cross oceans, but never truly come home. The morning sun bled through the haze over Clark Air Base, cutting through the drifting smoke of burned-out hangars. The engineers were already at work when Captain Harold Pierce, a test pilot from the 5th Fighter Command, stepped out of a jeep with his flight helmet tucked under one arm. He looked at the captured Betty glimmering on the runway and whistled softly. "So this is the famous fire trap everyone's talking about." Lieutenant Robert Ames turned from his clipboard. "That's the one." Japan's pride and death sentence rolled into one airframe. Pierce grinned, though uneasily. "Command wants me to take her up today. Says if she can still fly, we'll learn more from the sky than from your notebooks." Ames frowned. "That frame's thin as a soda can, Captain." "You sure it's worth the risk?" Pierce shrugged. "If she's light enough to float, she'll stay up. If not," he gave a half smile, "you'll have more data for your report." Ames didn't laugh. "We'll prep it for flight," he said grimly, "but keep the run short. No heroics." By mid-morning, a small crowd gathered, pilots, mechanics, and curious infantrymen leaning against sandbags to watch the impossible. The Betty's twin engines coughed to life, coughing blue smoke that quickly turned into a steady metallic whine. The red suns on its wings had been painted over with white stars, but the outline was unmistakably Japanese. Ames and Donovan stood near the edge of the runway as the props bit into the air. "Still can't believe we're doing this," Donovan muttered. "Neither can I," Ames replied, clutching his clipboard tight. "But at least we'll finally see how it moves." The bomber accelerated with startling grace. The moment its wheels left the ground, the watching men fell silent. It climbed smoothly, its long wings slicing the humid air like blades. Over the radio, Pierce's voice crackled. "She's lighter than a B-25, handles like a dream, feels like a fighter on a leash." Ames could hear the thrill beneath his words, and the tension too. "Keep her gentle, Captain. Don't push it." "Copy that. She's holding steady, engine temp stable. Damn, she's fast." The Betty banked low over the airfield, its engines screaming. To those below, it looked almost effortless, like a bird gliding in slow motion. But inside the cockpit, Pierce could feel every shudder. The panels vibrated, the wings flexed visibly under even mild stress. Through the side windows he could see the aluminum skin rippling like fabric. One stray bullet in combat, he thought, and this entire ship would have turned into a funeral pyre. "Fuel pressure's touchy," he reported. "Can't shake the feeling this thing's holding its breath." "Bring her in," Ames ordered. "We've seen enough." The Betty came down smoothly, tires screeching against the wet runway. When the engines died, the only sound left was the hiss of cooling metal. The crowd applauded anyway, more in relief than admiration. Pierce climbed down, pulling off his helmet, face slick with sweat. "Well," he said, catching his breath, "she flies like a devil. But I wouldn't go to war in her for all the sake in Tokyo." Ames approached, notebook ready. "Your assessment?" Pierce thought for a moment. "Fast, elegant, and suicidal." He kicked one of the thin tires. "She's built to win battles, not wars." That night, the team stripped the bomber again. Floodlights bathed the hangar in pale yellow as they removed panels and traced wiring through the fuselage. The smell of grease and fuel filled the air. Donovan crouched under the wing, shining his flashlight into a small gap. "Sir, you've got to see this." Ames leaned over. The fuel lines, dozens of them, ran through the wing like veins, exposed and dangerously close to the electrical harness. One loose spark, one hit from flak, and the whole aircraft would ignite. "Every inch of it is a risk," Ames muttered. "They flew with a fuse built into their own wings." "Why design something like this?" Donovan asked, frustration in his voice. "Because they didn't have a choice," Ames said quietly. "They needed range more than life. The Pacific's too big for anything less." He tapped the exposed line with his pencil. Every extra mile meant another ship sunk, another convoy hit. Every layer of armor they stripped off bought them distance, until there was nothing left but speed and gasoline. The next morning, Ames called his team around a makeshift chalkboard. Drawings and notes covered it. Diagrams of the Betty's fuel system, stress points and range calculations. He pointed with his pencil. "This aircraft could fly over 3,700 miles. That's almost twice the range of most of our twin-engine bombers. It's how they hit the Prince of Wales and Repulse in 41 from hundreds of miles away." Donovan raised a brow. "Those were the British battleships, right? The ones sunk off Malaya?" "Exactly," Ames said. "The first time capital ships were destroyed solely by air power. And these were the planes that did it." He paused. "They may have been fragile, but they changed the world." The room went quiet. Outside, distant thunder rolled over the hills. Later that evening, while most of the men rested, Ames stayed behind, studying fragments of Japanese manuals found in a damaged office. The ink was smeared, but the diagrams were unmistakable. Range charts, fuel calculations, mission profiles. He flipped through until one phrase caught his eye, scrawled in neat Japanese script beside a sketch of the bomber. "Return not guaranteed." Ames stared at it for a long moment. Return not guaranteed. That was the philosophy. Pure, brutal clarity. He stood, looking through the hangar's open doors at the dark silhouette of the Betty under the moonlight. The captured bomber gleamed faintly, rain dripping from its nose like tears. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a confession. The Japanese engineers had known it would burn. They'd accepted it. Because in their logic, a plane that reached the target and perished was still a success. Ames closed the notebook and whispered to himself, "They built a masterpiece to die." And as thunder cracked again beyond the airfield, he realized he finally understood what he'd been studying all along. Not just a machine, but a nation's soul, forged from ambition and fire. For days, rain battered Clark Air Base, turning the runway into rivers of mud. The engineers worked through it all, sleeves rolled up, notebooks soaked, pencils wrapped in cloth to keep them dry. The Betty bomber stood on wooden blocks inside the hangar, half disassembled, surrounded by fuel drums and toolboxes. Its skin, once sleek and proud, now looked like the shell of some extinct creature dissected by curious hands. Lieutenant Robert Ames moved around it quietly, eyes red from lack of sleep. He'd been writing for hours, compiling every test result, every observation, every theory. Yet something still gnawed at him. This aircraft shouldn't have worked. And yet it did. Brilliantly for a time. "Sir," Sergeant Donovan called out, flipping through his own notes, "we finished the stress analysis. Even at top speed, the wing structure only just holds together. Any hard turn, and she'd probably snap." Ames looked up. "That fragile, huh?" Donovan nodded grimly. "Like flying glass." Ames ran a hand along the skeletal wing frame. "And still, they used it for 4 years straight." He sighed and turned toward the nose of the plane, where technicians were removing the final cockpit instruments. They built it to reach, not to last. That's the paradox. Every war machine has one. You can't have speed, armor, and range all at once. You have to choose. Donovan smiled faintly. "Guess they chose distance." "Distance," Ames repeated. "And death." That evening, as the rain eased, Ames stood outside under the low metal roof, smoking a cigarette. The jungle beyond the airfield was alive with sound. Frogs, insects, the occasional distant crack of artillery. The war wasn't over yet, but it was turning. Japan's empire was shrinking by the day. Captain Harold Pierce joined him, pulling up a stool. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Not since I started reading those captured manuals," Ames said. "They weren't designing for survival. They were designing for inevitability." Pierce tilted his head. "Inevitability?" Ames flicked ash into the puddles. "They knew they couldn't outproduce us. So they built aircraft that could do what ours couldn't. Fly further, strike deeper, with fewer bases. The range of this thing? Over 3,700 miles. It's how they hit Ceylon, Darwin, even deep into the Indian Ocean. No other bomber could reach that far without refueling." Pierce chuckled dryly. "And they paid for it with their lives." Ames nodded. "Every time they took off." He looked back toward the hangar. The floodlight illuminated the wreck in pale gold. The shape was undeniably elegant, even now. The long, slender fuselage, the graceful taper of the wings. "You know what's strange?" Ames said. "The longer I study it, the more respect I have for the men who flew it. They knew they were sitting inside a fuel tank with engines." Pierce's tone softened. "I've seen them burn in the air. Brightest damn fires you'll ever see. They'd take a few hits and boom, gone in a heartbeat." He paused. "But sometimes they still hit their targets before dying." "That's what makes it haunting," Ames replied. "They lost their lives to prove a point. That range could win wars." 2 days later, the team performed fuel capacity tests. They used water to fill the tanks and measure leakage, since gasoline would have been too dangerous. Within minutes, tiny streams began seeping from the rivet lines, dozens of leaks glistening like sweat. "Unreal," Donovan muttered. "It's like the thing's bleeding." Ames crouched beside the wing root, watching the droplets fall. Self-sealing tanks would have stopped this instantly, but they removed every layer of rubber to save weight. Every pound gone bought them more miles. He stood, voice low. "It's engineering brilliance and madness." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. None of them spoke for a while, as if the machine itself demanded silence. That night, inside the command hut, Ames reviewed their findings by lantern light. Pages of sketches, notes, and diagrams were spread across the table. His report was almost finished, all except for one conclusion he couldn't quite bring himself to write. He began reading an intercepted Japanese document translated by intelligence officers, an account of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death. The paper described how his personal transport, a Betty bomber, had been intercepted and shot down over Bougainville in April 1943. The aircraft had exploded in mid-air, killing everyone aboard instantly. Ames leaned back in his chair. So even Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had died inside the very machine he'd championed, burned alive by the same design philosophy he'd approved. The irony was brutal, almost poetic. He whispered to himself, they built their destiny right into their wings. The next morning, Donovan found Ames still sitting in the same chair, the report finished beside him. You ever wonder, Donovan asked, what the Japanese engineers thought when they first saw one of these burn? Ames looked up. They probably thought it was working. Donovan frowned. Working? Ames nodded. Because destruction was the goal. To them, victory wasn't about surviving the mission. It was about reaching the target, no matter the cost. He tapped the table. You see, that's the paradox. They built a bomber that was never meant to live, because they didn't see war the same way we did. For them, dying in success was better than surviving in failure. Donovan was quiet for a long moment. I guess that's why they called it the flying cigar. Burns bright, dies fast. Ames smiled sadly. Exactly. When the engineers finally received orders to ship the Betty back to the US for further study, Ames stood on the runway as the transport crew prepared it. The rain had stopped, and the sky glowed pale gold over the distant mountains. The bomber was strapped and chained, ready to be hauled away, its wings now detached, its engines silent. As the jeep pulled up beside him, Pierce leaned out the window. Guess she's going home, huh? Ames nodded. If you can call it that. Pierce grinned. You gonna miss her? Yeah, Ames said quietly. But I'll never forget her either. He watched as the aircraft was loaded, its once proud nose covered in tarps. The engines that had carried Japan's war thousands of miles across open ocean now hung lifeless, dripping oil into the mud. To most, it was just another relic, a trophy of victory. But to Ames, it was a warning carved in aluminum. He whispered to himself, range without mercy, speed without soul, fire without fear. And as the transport roared away, he realized that the Betty wasn't just a piece of enemy hardware. It was the ghost of an entire way of thinking, one that believed victory could be built from sacrifice alone. The cargo plane that carried the Betty back to America vanished into the pale Philippine sky, its engines rumbling over the bay until the sound was swallowed by the wind. Lieutenant Robert Ames stood watching it go until the speck of its tail disappeared completely. The runway around him shimmered with heat. Everything felt quieter now, as if the departure of that fragile machine had taken something intangible with it. For months he had lived inside the metal ghost of an enemy, measuring, studying, disassembling. But the real lesson had come only at the end. The Betty wasn't just a bomber. It was Japan's soul, forged into an aircraft, obsessed with reach, blind to consequence, certain that endurance alone could overcome everything. He turned toward Sergeant Donovan, who was loading crates of spare parts into a truck. You ever notice, Ames said, how we always call it the Betty? Like she's alive. Donovan smirked. She sure acted like it. Burned fast, died young. Ames chuckled softly, though the humor didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, maybe that's why she haunts me. Weeks later, Ames was reassigned to the United States, to Wright Field, where captured Axis aircraft were studied under controlled conditions. He arrived in the chill of early March 1945, trading tropical humidity for the dry sting of winter. There, in a cavernous hangar filled with trophies of war, a German Me-262 jet, an Italian Machi fighter, and even a Japanese Zero, he found what was left of his Betty again. The plane looked even more fragile under the bright industrial lights. Its olive paint had been stripped away to reveal bare silver skin. The red sun insignias were gone, replaced by chalk markings and numbers for measurement. It seemed naked, exposed, a thing robbed of its purpose. Ames placed a hand on its cool metal surface. "You made it halfway around the world," he whispered. "Guess even ghosts travel." An older engineer beside him, Colonel Whitmore, noticed the gesture. "You were the one who worked on it in the Philippines, right?" "That's right, sir." Whitmore nodded toward the fuselage. "We've confirmed your findings. No self-sealing tanks, no armor. Honestly, it's a miracle it ever stayed airborne." Ames smiled faintly. A miracle built on math and courage. They spent the next several days documenting the Betty's remains with the precision of surgeons. Engineers weighed components, charted airflow diagrams, and compared materials. Again and again, the same truth appeared. Everything in the design screamed efficiency and risk in equal measure. "The fuel system," one technician remarked, "is basically suicide plumbing. But the range numbers are real. With this setup, she could reach Guam from Tokyo." Whitmore grunted. "And never make it back." Ames leaned over the table, flipping through the translated blueprints. "Exactly. That's the difference between their doctrine and ours. We build machines to win and return. They built machines to make victory worth dying for." Whitmore gave him a look. "That's one hell of a philosophy." "It's one hell of a warning," Ames replied. That evening, Ames sat alone at his desk, finishing his final report. The lights hummed softly overhead. He could hear the wind outside howling through the Ohio hangars, rattling the old windows. His pen moved slowly, deliberately. The Mitsubishi G4M embodies the extremes of wartime engineering. It achieved record-breaking range by abandoning all protection for its crew. This decision was not error, but design, a reflection of Japan's strategic and cultural mindset during the war. He paused. In the pursuit of reach, they sacrificed resilience. In the pursuit of victory, they accepted death. The Betty was a masterpiece built to burn, an engineering triumph and a human tragedy bound together by the same fire. He sat back, staring at the page for a long moment before setting down his pen. The report was finished, but the unease remained. Months later, as the war drew to its close, Ames found himself back in the Pacific, this time walking through the ruins of an abandoned Japanese airstrip on Okinawa. The fighting had ended. The air smelled of rust and sea salt. Amid the wreckage lay another Betty, broken in half, its wings charred and bent, the cockpit glass melted into puddles. He crouched beside it, brushing away soot. Beneath the blackened paint, the faint outline of the rising sun still showed through. Faded, defiant. He whispered, "So it ends where it began." He thought of all the men who had sat behind those controls, trusting in speed, in range, in faith, knowing that one tracer round could erase them from the sky. And still, they had flown. He ran his fingers along the bullet holes in the wing, each one a frozen instant of violence. "You didn't fail," he said softly. "You just belonged to a world that burned itself out." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of gasoline from the shattered tanks, faint but unmistakable. It was the same smell that had followed him since Clark Field. Back in America, years later, the Betty would end up in a museum, polished, restored, its deadly flaws reduced to placard text. Visitors would stop, read a few lines, and move on. Most would never understand what it meant. Not really. They would see it as a relic of a defeated enemy, not as the paradox it truly was, the beauty of efficiency wrapped around the certainty of death. But Ames would remember. He would remember how it had looked under the Philippine sun, green wings stretched over the mud, delicate and proud. He would remember the hollow sound when he'd knocked on its skin, the echo that told him the truth. A lifetime later, as an old man, he would still dream of it, that impossible machine soaring above endless blue water, sunlight glinting on its wings, crew inside silent and calm, unaware or unconcerned that one spark could end them all. And in those dreams the Betty never burned. It just flew, endless, unbroken, free,